Good evening, everyone. We're going to get started with tonight's community meeting. The issue before us is the draft Tenant Relocation Assistance Ordinance that's being proposed by the Housing Commission. Tonight's meeting is, again, a community meeting. This is not a commission meeting, but we are going to give a brief overview of the draft ordinance and then open it up for public comment. And the comments are being recorded, and they will be reported to the Housing Commission and ultimately to the City Council. So if you would like to speak when that time comes, please fill out a card from the table in the back of the room and give it to my colleague, Mike Noche, here at the front table. And then we'll call you up to speak in the order in which we received your card. So, although this is not an official Housing Commission meeting, we do have 3 of our Housing Commissioners in attendance, and I'd like to introduce them. We have our Vice Chair, Nevada Merriman. We have Commissioner Wendy McPherson. And we have Commissioner Karen Grove. So, all right, we'll do a brief presentation and then get this open for public comment. All right. On the table in the back of the room is a copy of the staff report. It includes a little bit of background information and an overview of the ordinance, as well as an attachment of the draft ordinance language in both English and Spanish. But this discussion started in about a year and a half ago, in January 2017, when the City Council hosted a study session on displacement. At that time, they listened to a panel of experts and talked about various solutions that we could explore in Menlo Park to help reduce displacement. On August 22nd, the City Council approved a list of housing policy priorities, and among them, in the group of the first priority was the Tenant Relocation Assistance. The Housing Commission began reviewing this with a draft ordinance that was discussed at their July 11th, 2018 meeting. They made further revisions in August, and here we are now. We have had one meeting last night to discuss it and get more broad public feedback. Tonight's meeting is very similar, and you can always learn more about the draft on our website at menlopark.org/relocation assistance. The purpose of the draft ordinance and relocation assistance in general is to provide a safety net for those who are suddenly displaced. Statistics show that sudden and unexpected displacement often leads to homelessness, and we're trying to minimize that and minimize the disruption to households and to our community. The relocation assistance payments that are proposed are meant to reduce the short-term financial burden on these displaced tenants. It can be used to cover the first and last month's rent, any security deposit, and related moving expenses that are often very difficult, not only when you're facing a change in your rent on a monthly basis, but then to suddenly have to have all these related expenses for moving or new deposits. It also helps, like as I said, preserve community continuity. This involves both neighborhoods, community organizations, and the children who are in our neighborhood schools. We're going to go through some of the key provisions from the current draft. First and foremost, the Commission is asked to make this ordinance an urgency ordinance, which means that it would take effect immediately upon adoption. That's different from most ordinances that are introduced at one meeting, have a second reading at the next meeting, and then become effective after 30 days. Urgency ordinances are used to preserve the public peace, health, or safety. When they are adopted, it requires a declaration of facts that are used to justify and explain the urgency of the matter. It also requires a 4/5 vote of the City Council, and an urgency ordinance can still be challenged on the basis of those urgency findings. So best practice for cities is to adopt an urgency ordinance and at the same time adopt a non-urgency ordinance, so that if the urgency is challenged or fails to pass with a 4/5 vote, perhaps the regular non-urgency ordinance will still become effective in a reduced time as opposed to starting the whole process over. One definition in the draft ordinance is eligible tenant. This covers who qualifies for the relocation assistance payments. One key component is the length of tenancy. It applies to tenants who have lived in the unit for 12 months or more. This is aligned with the city's 12-month lease ordinance. It also includes income limit. The Commission has set the income limit at 200% of the area median income. For San Mateo County, the area median income for 2018 is $82,900 for a single person, or $118,400 for a family of four. One thing that has come up in some of the commission discussions is, what is a reasonable amount for someone to pay? And the federal government has guidelines that they refer to as the rent burden, and this defines reasonable rent as no more than 30% of a household income. So what this chart here shows is the different categories that appear on the income charts published by the state of California. We have calculated the rent burden amount, so 30% of that income on a monthly basis is listed on the first line. And then we took the average monthly Menlo Park rent for a 2-bedroom apartment, and over a period from 2015 to 2018, it came out to an average of $3,685. And then the bottom line shows the difference between those two. So the gap for low income, very low income, extreme low income is quite sizable, and then it starts to even out a little bit once you get up above 120% AMI. This chart was taken from a San Mateo County housing report. It shows some of the salary averages. I believe this data, though, is on a statewide basis, but it shows kind of what different sectors of the labor market make as far as monthly income, and compare that to the monthly rent that we showed on the previous slide for Menlo Park. Just gives some perspective as to what workers are making and what they can afford to pay. The next provision is the landlord cost termination. This includes significant rent increases, which are defined as any rent increase or cumulative rent increases in a 12-month period that amount to more than last year's CPI. CPI is the Consumer Price Index and is published by the federal government as a way of measuring the cost of living, and it applies to quite a range of products that consumers purchase. So based on this draft ordinance, the trigger at this point would be approximately 8 or 9%, because CPI is about 3 or 4% right now. This ordinance covers many other landlord cost terminations, with the exception of a tenant's failure to pay rent, a tenant's breach of rental agreement, a tenant's committing or expressly permitting a continued nuisance, And at the August meeting of the Housing Commission, they added a owner move-in or owner use provision, which would allow an exception for a owner or a landlord who needs to move back into their rental property and use it as their primary residence due to their own financial constraints. The caveat on that is that if a landlord displaces a tenant and moves back in under this provision, they would have to stay in that unit for 12 months or more to avoid paying relocation assistance. So they can't just move in for 3 months, force someone out, and somehow work out or work around the relocation payment. The next key provision is the rental unit. In this draft, it's defined as pretty much any housing unit in Menlo Park. This includes, but not limited to, apartments, condos, duplexes, and single-family homes. It does not apply to affordable housing units that are already deed restricted or income limited. It does not apply to secondary dwelling units, also known as the granny units or in-law units or backyard units. And it does not apply to rooms rented in an owner-occupied single-family home. The relocation amount, or what is proposed to be made available to a tenant who is displaced, is 3 months of market rate rent. That is proposed to be defined as a number that will be published by the community development director on an annual basis. We would hire a firm to calculate what the citywide average market rate rent is for a given period, and then that would be updated on an annual basis. And the payment would be 3 times whatever that monthly rent amount is. It also includes a 60-day subscription to a rental agency service. This is to help tenants find that next place to live. This is a very common provision. And then the draft also includes an extra month of assistance for special circumstance households, which are defined as those that have at least one member who are elderly, over 62 years of age, if they have a minor child, someone under 18 years of age, or are disabled. So that's the end of the staff presentation. It's kind of similar to what is proposed in the staff report, so you can read that at your leisure. But at this time, we'd like to open it for public comment and have you speak, and your comments will be recorded and shared with the commission and used to further inform the process. So I will call the cards out in the order in which we receive them. And the first speaker is Maya Seawald. Maya, thank you. Please come up to the podium and address the audience.
So first of all, thank you to all the committee members, because after serving on a lot of committees, it's not an easy task. So my comments are not personally directed to you. I am a real estate broker in Menlo Park. I've been in business approximately 24 years, and I think this ordinance as presented is unacceptable. A lot of my clients who are landlords rent their units out to probably the same kind of people we're talking about here at below market rents because they're good tenants. So if you start imposing restrictions on them, they are going to have to either raise the rents or, from many I've talked to in the last couple of days, just go ahead and sell the unit because they don't want to be bothered. So it's just not fair. In Clay's very good presentation, I think the words that missing all the time is landlord. Okay, so you're talking about the ordinance and what it's going to do and all that, but the key word that's missing is the landlord is the one that's going to pay for it. So again, in all my years, I have never ever seen an unfair rental increase. I would also like to share from somebody that's under rent control now in Mountain View. And for those of you who are interested in looking at the city's website, I sent an email 2 days ago with my points. And I also sent it to all my colleagues, et cetera. Hi, Maya, your instincts are right on about this issue. We have a nice rental condo in Mountain View. In the past, I only changed the rent when we changed tenants. The value of a good tenant is very high. Now that Mountain View has put in rent control, I feel I must raise it every year to keep up, or I won't be able to charge a new tenant a higher rate when the time comes. So, yep, I'm being forced into increasing rent. So I'm not going to beat the bushes any more than I've already done, but questions are, how many rental units do we have currently in Menlo Park? And how many have been displaced in those rental units? What are the percentages? How are you going to enforce it? Clay was just right on the spot about answering a question of mine about how are you going to base the rent, and it was like, oh, we're going to hire a consultancy service, more government money. How are you going to establish what a tenant makes? I mean, think of this. If people are renting, right, they don't have big incomes anyway. So, you know, you're hurting the very people you're trying to help. And so I think that would be my main points. But I would urge the Housing Commission to come up with perhaps our local corporations building more affordable housing for people. We've got plenty of money in this valley. There's no reason to penalize my clients who are just one rental property owners and use it for retirement income. Thank you.
Okay, up next we have Leora Ross.
Hey everyone, my name is Leora Tanwatko-Ross, and I'm here on behalf of the Housing Leadership Council of San Mateo County. Our mission is to work with communities and their leaders to create and preserve quality, affordable homes. I'm going to speak more from a personal standpoint, but one of our members, Bill, is going to speak about more of the data behind this ordinance. I live close to here, about 3 miles away in Palo Alto. I live with my husband's parents. And I've been a renter my whole life. And there was a time right after college when my rent was 75% of my monthly income. And so after I paid for my food and my transportation expenses every month, if I had $10 in the bank, I was really, really happy. And once I got a rent increase, it was $50 a month. And I know that it doesn't sound like a lot, but to me it was a lot because it was more than a week's worth of food for me. And so I stopped eating meat because it was too expensive. I stopped going to the doctor or the dentist. I would stand in the grocery store and look at per pound and per unit how much everything cost, everything I was buying to the penny. And then when I got to the register to check out, I would pray that my card would be accepted because I had a debit card. And so after 2 years of living this way, I started to have health problems, as we know from research that chronic stress precludes you to a lot of different symptoms. So one day I woke up and I couldn't get out of bed, and long story short, I ended up in the hospital. And because I had to quit my job because of my illness, I didn't have any health insurance. So thankfully, my grandmother, she paid my medical bills for me, and she gave me a place to stay in her house. But not everybody has that. Not everybody has like a fairy grandmother like I do. So I can tell you that I would have experienced homelessness if it weren't for my grandmother. And I went to grad school. I've worked for full time for most of my life, and that wasn't enough to keep me in a secure home. So tonight, we're talking about a policy that could keep people off the streets. It could save them. It could buy them some time while they figure out where they're going to go next. So I asked the Housing Commission to please move it forward and to protect the diversity that we have, protect the community that we have here, and to pass this tenant relocation assistance. Thank you. Bill, go ahead. Take it away.
Thanks, Leora, and good evening, Honorable Housing Commissioners and staff. My name is Bill Knack. I've been a resident of Menlo Park for 23 years. I'm not here representing any organization. I'm here this evening to support staff's recommended tenant relocation assistance ordinance. This proposed ordinance gives renters some measure of comfort while at the same time implementing reasonable protections for landlords. This proposed ordinance does not prevent landlords from levying rent increases. I repeat, this proposed ordinance does not prevent landlords from levying rent increases. It does, however, say that if you levy significant rent increases under certain circumstances and the tenant elects not to remain, or termination of tenancy under certain circumstances, you'll have to help your tenant so that he or she has a better chance of staying in our community of Menlo Park and not become homeless. According to the proposed ordinance, a landlord can raise rent equal to the previous year's consumer price index for our area, plus 5%, above the base rate that was in place at the beginning of the 12-month period, which, if I understand the data correctly, on the Bureau of Labor Statistics for our areas, the CPI increase for the past 12 months was 4.3%. Add that to the 5% a landlord for this year can raise the rent by 9.3% with no penalty. In the industry I come from, we don't see annual raises anywhere close to 9.3%. Even my property tax under Prop 13 can only go up 2% a year. Add to that the protections for the landlord, such as failure to pay rent, breach of rental agreement, nuisance, and owner move-in. In addition, this ordinance won't apply to recorded affordable housings, secondary dwellings, and owner-occupied single-family homes. In closing, it looks like to me this ordinance will help mitigate financial hardship on terminations and increases to renters in the most extreme circumstances. According to the staff report, it will give landlords clear understanding of their responsibilities on this issue, and we hope it will help prevent homelessness. When tenants, through no fault of their own, lose their shelter, is detrimental to our community. But providing them with some assistance when they have to leave their homes gives them a chance. A few $1,000s could mean the difference between finding a new apartment and sleeping on the streets. So to summarize, I wholeheartedly support this proposed ordinance, and I thank you for allowing me to speak to you this evening.
Up next is Kurt Conroy.
Good evening, Menlo Park resident for 29 years. I'd like to speak to the issue of rent control as a policy in general, of which relocation assistance payments are a component. Supporters of rent control often cite the work of Stephen Barton, PhD in City and Regional Planning from Berkeley. He recommends rent control as a way of reducing the hardships and displacement of tenants in markets experiencing rapid rent inflation. These are worthy objectives, for sure, and certainly the Bay Area has experienced a housing shortage in recent years. Mr. Barton defends what he considers a mild form of rent control known as rent stabilization, which property owners can raise rents of units when they experience turnover. He argues that this form of rent control, with this feature known as vacancy decontrol, doesn't reduce the new construction in markets on which such regulation is imposed. Certainly, vacancy decontrol and the exemption of new construction from any rent restrictions, as is the case under current California law, has allowed construction to continue in the jurisdictions practicing rent control. However, Mr. Barton ignores the fact that any form of rent control results in property owners removing their units from the market, thereby exacerbating the supply and demand imbalance. A study by Stanford Business School professors Rebecca Diamond and Tim McQuaid, released earlier this year, analyzed the impact of San Francisco's rent control program from 1994 through 2010. The statistical analysis found that as a result of property owners removing their rental units from the market, that the supply of rent-controlled units dropped by 25%, and the total stock of rental housing declined by 5%. The resulting shortage of rental housing was a rise in San Francisco's rents above what they otherwise would have been, with a cumulative impact of $2.9 billion loss to renters over the period. This is mirrored in other cities where rent control has been instituted, which is why New York and San Francisco have the highest rents in the country. By contrast, Chicago, which has no form of rent control due to a statewide prohibition, has quite affordable housing, with the average renter spending only 20% of his or her income on housing. Swedish economist Assar Lindbeck once famously quipped that except for bombing, rent control was the best way to destroy a city. Though perhaps a bit of an exaggeration, I think that Palo Alto Councilman Eric Filseth summed up the truth of rent control when last October that city voted on and rejected such policy, saying, quote, "Rent control has a tendency to help a few people right away and hurt a lot more in the long run." The simple fact is that rent control, though well-intended, only really helps the people in place at the time the laws pass, to the detriment of the community's future renters forever after. We should avoid any such policies in Menlo Park, but encourage the development of market-rate housing to accommodate our growing community. Thank you.
Up next is Julie Shanson.
Thank you. I think that this ordinance and anti-displacement policies in general are key to ensuring that changes we want to see, like housing near transit, happen in a way that's equitable. I also see this ordinance as a step toward homelessness prevention. 18% of people facing evictions in court end up homeless. And in 2016, 34% of the children in the Ravenswood School District were classified as homeless. Here in Menlo Park, we are making an attempt to address a long-term problem of displacement created by excessive rent increases for those who have the least. And I'm strongly in favor of this ordinance.
Our next speaker is Matthew Barazzi. Okay, thank you.
Hey folks, I think while the goals of this are admirable, there are a decent number of portions of the proposal, at least the one that I've seen, that are either inconsistent with current city policy or actually even with some state laws. I've been both a tenant and a landlord in this town, as well as a single family homeowner. And I want to make sure that the law makes sense and is fair to everybody, agreeing with the city precedents and also the state law. As it stands right now, there's a few items that don't make a lot of sense to me. So the first one is, I think we need to call this what it is, which is rent control. There's no end date. It's not an emergency measure. We're basically also letting the city off the hook, building like tens of thousands of jobs worth of business housing, not enough business space without building enough housing. It's just going to go on and get worse and worse. I'm also wondering why we're tagging it to a city-determined amount. Why not scale it to the landlord's means and previous generosity? There's a lot of landlords, myself included, that keep things well below market, at least looking at the data that was presented. I don't need every last dollar right now. That's pretty good. I'd much rather have friendly tenants that are nice and stable. This provides a pretty strong disincentive and would make me want to raise my rents 8-9% a year. That sucks. And then again, either staff's doing the work or hiring somebody else. It seems really easy to prove what the previous rent was. In fact, it's a needed part of this measure. Make it 3 months, 4 months of that, not 3 months or 4 months of something for potentially a housing unit that's much, much nicer than the current one. Why 12 months and not 36? I believe there was a draft earlier for 36. I don't know if 12 months makes you a really embedded member of the community or not, especially when you consider the other costs. How does this interact with Costa-Hawkins? Notice that it doesn't exclude post-1995 construction, doesn't exclude single-family homes. Mountain View does those things. We don't. don't want to be an immediate violation of state law. This isn't Redwood City's policy. It's pretty obvious if you read Redwood City's policy. It's about trying to preserve rental housing on the market. It's limited to larger apartment buildings, and it's pretty obvious that the money for the relocation payment there is supposed to come as part of a capital outlay during a large redevelopment project. It's not about sinking tiny landlords that are just trying to, stay alive too, all right? It's not Mountain View's policy. 200% versus 120%. I could end up shelling out, $10,000 to somebody who makes $250,000 a year. I mean, if you look at the data that was presented right here, I don't understand why it's 120 versus 200. It seems like people that make really healthy incomes shouldn't be covered by this. And I think the last one, to echo the first speaker, this is just going to cause people to take single-family residences off the market, duplexes, triplexes as well. Like, they're going to want their returns. If they can't go and get their returns through the rental market, they're just going to sell to somebody whose income is far more than that $250,000, and then it's gone. It's never going to come back. Thanks.
Our next speaker is Sarah Chafin.
Hi, my name is Sarah Chaffin, and I'm an advocate for teacher housing and the missing middle. And I'm here today because I wanted to talk about the fact that tenant displacement is a huge issue, not just for low-income people, but also for the missing middle, which includes our teachers. And basically, one of the fastest growing population of homeless people in this area are basically families that are working. Because if you think about it, first month's, last month's, and security deposit to move is roughly $10,000, and most people are living paycheck to paycheck. So I think that this ordinance is very important. I also think it's very important that it does go above, just 120% of median income, that it actually does go up to that 200%, because really the missing middle, which are those people that are working, but they cannot afford a housing in this area, is very, very important. And essentially what happens is if you have let's say you have two teachers in a household, they will make over that 120% of median income, and then they could potentially be displaced. There are actually homeless teachers in this area. And then the final thing that I would like to say is I do understand that this could really negatively impact small landlords. So I think that it would be important to the policy that there should be some kind of hardship waiver where if you couldn't do this, and it doesn't make sense for, let's say, a small landlord or a pensioner, that they would be able to apply to the city for some kind of dispensation. And I hope that a private philanthropic fund could be set up so that if the landlord cannot afford to help with displacement, there's a philanthropic fund or some kind of community benefit that can help out, because we want to, help our residents, but we have to remember sometimes too, some of those landlords are pensioners that can't afford this policy. So I think some sort of dispensation is very important so it can be balanced. Okay, thank you.
Our next speaker is Patricia McBrayer.
Hi, I'm Patricia McBrayer and an 18-year resident of West Menlo Park. I'm also an architect. I want to thank you, Commission, for considering this Tenant Relocation Assistance Program. It is actually a very vital component of the entire toolkit of options we have available to us to addressing the housing crisis in our community. It has potential to help not only tenants, it has potential to be reasonable for landlords and very helpful to the community at large. One of the reasons I want to speak is because I actually live across the street from one of Maya, your first speaker, her clients. And I've lived across from this property the 18 years I've lived here. It's been rented the whole time, and it's been rented for substantially longer than I've lived there. The original owner had been in the house for decades, actually, before I moved in. Since I've been there, the house has turned over. I just ran through the tenants 6 times. Each time I knew the tenants who lived across the street from me quite well. I knew what they were paying, and I knew the rents were actually quite competitive with what else was available in the neighborhood. They were not low for what was in the neighborhood. Each time, the rent was increased quite substantially, and the tenants had to make the decision that maybe they could stay and maybe they couldn't, and each time they left. The most recent time it turned over, the people who lived across the street from me were lovely people. They both had worked at Stanford for a very long time. In fact, the woman was preparing to retire within the year, and then they got hit with a very large rent increase. With 2 of them working good professional jobs at Stanford, they were not able to afford the increase. They were trying to figure out what to do. They had a young adult son who was returning from college. I'll be honest with you, with the stress of all this on top of everything else, the marriage fell apart. The woman and her young adult son ended up homeless, couch surfing with friends, moving from place to place to place for almost a year. During that entire time, the unit sat empty. The house sat empty. The landlord wasn't getting rent. My friend was trying to save enough money to get a down payment for the next place. She finally did. Her story has a reasonable ending. She is now living in a small one-bedroom apartment with her adult son. He's on a bed in the dining room. She's in the living room. They had been in a 3-bedroom home. But they have a reasonable ending. Many stories don't end this way. Tenant relocation assistance can be a very effective tool in stabilizing the housing market and balancing the needs of both tenants and owners. It is not rent control. It's good for the renter. It's good for the owner because it allows and helps support long-term stable renters. And it's great for the community. For all these reasons, it's an effective and important tool to have in our housing toolbox. If that home were to be sold, some landlords are going to make that decision, and that's fine because then it goes on the market and it remains a viable housing option. We have other options to continue to look into for building more and more housing. It's not a problem if that one unit turns over or a small number turn over. Keep in mind that this is just one tool in a bigger toolbox for addressing the deep problem of affordable housing within our communities. Thank you.
Up next is Peter Hart.
Hi, I'm Peter Hart. Thanks for the time. The economists loved reminding us that when you make something more expensive, you get less of it. And so I think it's pretty safely predictable that the medium-term impact of this ordinance over time will be to reduce the number of single-family homes that are available for rent in Menlo Park, as some of the other speakers alluded to. If that's viewed as an undesirable, unintended consequence of the ordinance as written, then I think it's reasonable to consider excluding single-family residential from the ordinance. I'll also point out that notwithstanding the previous speaker's anecdotal account, most of the horror stories, in fact, all the horror stories that I've read, often from neighboring towns, involve much larger complexes than single-family residential, like the President Hotel story, for example, in Palo Alto. So in part, I'm echoing some of the previous speakers. I think this is a well-intentioned solution that will have real benefits to current renters, but over the longer period of time will be harmful to the community if we include single-family residential. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Cheryl Beecher.
Hello, my name is Cheryl Beecher, and I'm a tenant of East Menlo Park. And I wasn't expecting to get up and speak today, but I'll do my best. And I just have a concern about the increase also because I am disabled and I'm finally working part-time. And I've been in my place where I live for 5 years now. And when I moved in, it was $1,800. Now it's $2,500, and I'm in a 2-bedroom. I am disabled. I'm doing my best to try to keep up with this rental increase. Thank God I do have a good landlord that's trying to help me. But I still see all these increases going up. And, I appreciate that the community is a lot better now, and I'm trying to stay where I'm at. But I'm really concerned when it comes to me having to move. So I'm just here to support the relocation assistance for tenants. And, I have no other complaints because I do have a good landlord and he's doing his best to work with me. But, right now I see him increasing because there's tenants that's already have to move because they can't afford it. And I just want to make sure that, East Menlo Park doesn't have rental, it doesn't have, like East Palo Alto rent control. So I just want to, show my concern that I support the relocation assistance for tenants. And I appreciate I'm speaking to everyone, and thank you so much.
Our next speaker is Valerie Couletz.
I'm a recent resident of Menlo Park who's been displaced. And I'd like to offer my testimony, anecdotal testimony, to be added to the record in support of Tenant Relocation Assistance. Last year, on September 11th, my husband and I were evicted from our apartment here in Menlo Park. We have never been evicted before, and we have always paid our rent, and we've been renters our entire adult lives. We were paying $3,000 a month for a slightly run-down 2-bedroom apartment on Noel Street, easy walking distance from here. My husband, who was working at Google as an editor and tech writer at the time, was unexpectedly laid off from his job. He had recently been diagnosed with Fuchs syndrome, which is a disease of the cornea that is not surgically, if not surgically corrected, results in permanent blindness. This disease began to advance rapidly to the point where he was quickly losing his eyesight. I was not working due to my own serious illness, which is melanoma. Medical costs for that had devastated our savings, so we had nothing to fall back on. This is when Richard was suddenly laid off, and he was beginning to go blind. So as Richard began the first of his cornea transplant surgeries, I did everything possible to access affordable housing, to get help from local agencies. We even went to Menlo Park City Hall and requested that they help us in some way. What could we do? We do not have family to put us up, and we didn't. I cannot be in a shelter because I have little immune system left from my years of surgeries and treatments, and I cannot be exposed to the sun to try to survive outside. We could no longer wait on surgery for my husband. If we did, he would risk permanent blindness. Even knowing all of this, our landlord refused to work with us in any way. Because we were 1 month late on half of our rent, he would not accept our getting a roommate through the city program in a 2-bedroom apartment. We had an extra room. Waiting lists for seniors. We're both seniors, by the way, so that should be taken into account here as well. Waiting lists for senior housing were 5 years long, and no one was willing to bend the rules. We contested our eviction in court and took our landlord to court, but were able only to come out of it with a no-fault eviction determination, because the courts are decidedly in favor of the property owners. On September 11th, we were evicted. We lost nearly everything that we owned. All of our possessions were placed outside on the sidewalk and taken by anyone who happened by. It was only through the help of St. Vincent de Paul and a handful of people that heard of what had happened to us that we were helped with motels until I could convince the director of a senior affordable apartment complex, to agree to take us, even though we were not on their waiting list. It was only through luck, that we survived. There was no program of any kind that was in place for the housing people at City Hall to help us. For some of us, particularly seniors like ourselves, but also others with extenuating circumstances such as ours, homelessness is not simply having to sleep in a car or be uncomfortable. It's a matter of life and death, or blindness, or other overwhelming, serious consequences. If we had had access to a program like the Tenant Relocation Assistance Program, we would not have had to lose everything we owned or rely only on the chance luck of receiving help from a few people of means who have a conscience. It took us 4 months after this horrible eviction for my husband's surgeries to end, for him to heal, and eventually to return to Google. 4 months. One of the suggestions for the Tenant Relocation Assistance Program is to provide rental assistance for 4 months. This would have been a tremendous help. I strongly urge you to create such a program. Believe me, there is nothing out there at any level of governance that provides this important service. Nothing. Even if you're making in excess of $100,000 a year, as we were, you can be subject to sudden changes in the market or subject to poor health. The companies that provide you with high incomes and good housing can remove these props at any time, thanks to a contingent workforce. I know that this affects many people from different positions on the class scale. And I just want to emphasize that it can happen to anyone. I mean, before we came here, I was teaching at Berkeley. And I was writing, so I didn't have work at the time when this happened. And we're much better now, but it's very important that something be put in place that is not just the luck of the draw for people. So I would strongly encourage the commissioners to take this seriously. And it is not just a horror story. There are many people who experience this kind of thing. It's not just something that happens to the few. Okay, that's it. Thanks.
Our next speaker is Victoria Robledo.
Good evening. It's a lot said. I work with affordable housing. I work with an agency that places people who are displaced. I work housing the elderly, domestic violence, foster youth, individuals, and families. And I'm seeing the challenges that they have on a day-to-day basis, even as we're trying to house them. I work with some wonderful landlords. However, I also see the opportunity that any chance they get, they raise the rents, where it's getting so difficult that as we try to replace some of our clients that have been displaced, they can't afford that even with assistance. And so I think we have to look at so many alternatives in which we can do what we can to have some form of rent control, because it is out of control. I also work with landlords who are fabulous. They're great. But given the opportunity to raise it, they're going to raise it. And sometimes they raise it to a point where they're displacing somebody that we're trying to house or has been housed. And it's at a point where even if they're getting assistance through the government, through housing, sometimes the housing authority is not able to now pay what the increase of that rent is. And so I think with all of the challenges that we have, I'm born and raised here in the Bay Area. I live in Belhaven. I've seen the changes. Medium income, I'm low income. And so the difficulty of having below market rate units, that doesn't even really house the people that are at the lowest rates. And you're talking teachers, landscapers, you know it all. You know everybody that is in that category. And I do hope that you can consider the commissioners coming up with a program that will be effective for everybody, that can help those that are being displaced and help those even stay in their current residence. If there's funding that can be applied towards rather relocating them, help them pay some of their rent. Because even if they're going to be relocated, where are they going to be relocated to? I mean, most of the people that are trying to stay here because they're born and raised here and they want to stay here with their family. So to relocate them out of the Bay Area is not what they choose to do, and then try to commute back into the Bay Area where they work. So I think there has to be some form of control for rents, and maybe something that can work with the landlords. But I'm not going to say that landlords are hurting for money, because most of the landlords that I do work with, as great as they are, they have multiple units. There are 15 buildings that they own throughout San Mateo County, Santa Clara County. So I think with all the great landlords that we do have, I think greed is a big factor here. And I think it's an unfortunate factor because not everybody is making $150,000 a year. So I think we need to really be compassionate and understanding to those who aren't at that 150 category because they're hurting. And I would love for this area to stay diverse because that's what makes the Bay Area. And if we lose that, we lose more than we really think. Thank you.
Up next is Sandra Zamora.
Hi there. How are you? I am a Menlo Park resident, and I'm a preschool teacher. I recently got a raise of $800 in the last 6 months. Some of my neighbors got a raise of $1,200 in the last 6 months. This happened because our buildings got sold. Investors bought the property, and they sent us a letter, like 30 days later, stating that it was a new ownership and that our rents were going to be increased $800 to $1,200. At that time, I had just transferred to San Francisco State University, so it was shocking for me because now I had to choose. Should I go to school now, or should I just save the money to pay the increase that now I have to pay, which is a lot of money, $800. So I'm not going to school right now. I ended up skipping a semester to see how things are going to work out. In the meantime, I actually got shocked when I got that $800 increase. So I started searching to find out if that was actually legal. And I guess it is, because there is no rent control, no protections for tenants. This is a total of 4 buildings, and each building has 5 units. And it's about 20 families. It's a 1 2-bedroom apartment and 4 single 1-unit apartments. By the time we got the letter, the first 2 buildings, the people that lived there had already moved. And I know that because I wanted to talk to them and see, okay, what are we going to do? We need to get together and see if we can work things out with the new landlord. So we contacted the landlord, and they were not that helpful. They simply said, okay, we're just going to extend you after negotiation, like 3 or 4 months, with the help of East Palo Alto Legal Services. They extended the rent 2 more months. So we basically had 2 more months to leave or to pay whatever they were asking for. So as of now, the last two buildings that were the last ones to receive the notice, there is a total of probably 6 families now. Everybody has been, they moved, I don't know where they are, probably out of the county. So as a tenant, and I have experienced this whole situation with the increments of rent, I strongly support this ordinance. Because if now I had to quit my school to pay the rent, I'm thinking, okay, so all it takes is me to get sick, not go to work, and become probably homeless. I do not want to be, I've been independent since I got out of high school. And I've been living in this unit since I was 18. I consider myself independent, and I do not want to be depending in the government. But I feel like this is outrageous to get an $800 increase for people, for a good tenant. There is bad tenants and bad landlords. I consider my landlord bad because obviously they did not care about a tenant that paid rent on time, a tenant that didn't cause trouble, a tenant that was taking care of the unit, a tenant that didn't have parties, and all these crazy things that happen in the buildings. For me, if this ordinance passes, it'll help me a lot, at least to just relocate probably closer to school, so at least I can continue with my education. I know that there is more than this ordinance. This is not going to fix the problem. I know that there is other factors, like the area has changed a lot. When Facebook arrived, they actually helped to create this problem. Because 4 or 5 years ago, I was living there, and this was not happening. But because Facebook brought so many people into the area too, and not enough housing, which I've heard that the city has a lot of money to build housing. I don't know if that's true, but I heard just recently. Why is it not happening? I don't know. Why is that money just sitting there and not being in use? They can also help prevent this if they want. So now I'm going to read a few comments that were said yesterday at the other meeting, and I want to comment on those too. So this property manager said, when a landlord makes any fixes or any work in the property, someone needs to pay for it, meaning the tenant, meaning they need to get a raise in the rent. I don't think that's fair. Things get expensive, there's inflation, I understand that, but an $800 increase is just too much. I understand a $50 for me. I'm a single person, I don't have kids, I don't have pets either because I can barely survive myself. But for these families that have kids, $50, even $100 is way too much. Add to that other factors, being a senior, single mom, a bigger family. Imagine $800, $1,200. I don't think all landlords are bad, but there are some really bad landlords. And the good ones, yesterday I just met a good landlord at the other meeting, and I was at least happy that someone could understand what we were trying to say. There were other two ladies that came from San Francisco. Obviously, they have the money and the time to come all the way from there to say that we better save money to buy a house.
Excuse me,
And
Sandra.
that is outrageous. She had a very great, opinion, but she was comparing the 1950s with now. She said her parents bought a house working 3 jobs, earning $3 an hour. That's not the case right now. Homes are over $1 million. I had the chance to meet with Maya, which is she works for Facebook at the community center department, and she referred us to some agencies that can actually provide some programs for home ownership. But these programs are created not to be in use, because first of all, they have a max for $700,000. There is no home in the area for $700,000. Everything is over $1 million.
Excuse me, Sandra, can you start to wrap it up? We have
Okay.
a lot of
Sorry,
speakers to get
thank you.
through.
Finally, I just want to say, please help. I don't think it's just a one-side job. It involves tenants, property owners, and also the city to come together and fix this problem. For the meantime, this is just a small thing that I'm asking to please support the ordinance that will help me and a lot of other tenants that are on the verge of becoming homeless. Thank you.
All right, our next speaker is Pastor Baines.
Thank you, Commissioners, for allowing us to speak on this very important topic. This may sound strange, however, I'm going to say the ordinance is not the solution. However, it is a step in the right direction towards the solution. The solution is that we need extremely low income housing. But until those houses get built, we need to take the necessary steps to stop people being forced out. And these people primarily look like people like myself. They have a tan like I do, or they have an accent. It's affecting Latinos and African Americans and socially, economically disadvantaged people. And so unless you want to create a separate society within a community, there needs to be some steps toward the inequality that is happening within our region. The facts speak for themselves. If you check with San Mateo County Legal Aid, they have the facts. The facts show that this affects people of color the most, people with families the most, people who do not have the Facebook incomes, and some that work at Facebook but not Facebook employees because they're the janitors, they're the cooks, the security guards. It affects them. And so I encourage us to consider not just this ordinance, but many other methodologies, strategies to address the systemic issues that is dividing us as the human race. Gentrification on steroids is what I call what's going on. I've talked to my my friendly partners of faith, whether they're Muslim, whether they're Jewish, whether they're Christian, whatever, and encouraging them to take their properties and develop their properties for extremely low income properties. Not affordable, because affordable is relative on who can afford it, but extremely low income. So we want to be a part of the solution, because I refuse to be more problem consumed. I like to be more solution driven. And I think that this ordinance will help. We established one in East Palo Alto in 1985. And if we hadn't, East Palo Alto would look totally different today. So it can work. It does work, but it takes all of us because none of us is as strong as all of us. And the quicker we realize that, I think the better shape we will be in. I do think that there should be a friendly amendment to the ordinance for those landlords that are small, those landlords that this is their only income that they've worked hard for. I believe in people making a profit, but let's not forget about the needy with the greedy. So thank you for that time.
Up next is Dwayne Goff.
Thank you, Commissioners, for this opportunity to address this issue. I'd like to start off with a little quote from the San Francisco Chronicle. It said, "Walk down virtually any street in the city, and you'll not only see a wide range of people of color, but chances are good that you'll hear any number of non-English languages. This is a city that's proud of its diversity and has done what it can to encourage it. But a recent study says that if trends continue, San Francisco is headed in the opposite direction. In fact, the report from PolicyLink says the white population in San Francisco is on a steady increase. To take it further, the organization projects that by 2040, there will be more white residents in San Francisco than people of color. That's a big change from today, when 42% of the city's residents are white." That was written on April 24th, 2015. And what they expected to happen has very definitely happened, except what the other thing they expected to happen has not happened, and that is that it's striking because the study also predicts that in the same time period, the 4 adjoining counties, Alameda, Contra Costa, San Mateo, and Marin, will become more than 50% diverse. And the reason that's important is because you have to, when you're considering this ordinance, you have to realize you are talking about hardworking, low-income people of diversity, and it's diversity that's made America great. We cannot afford to lose that diversity. So 3 years ago, that was the prediction, that San Mateo County would grow in diversity. But the people of color whose roots go back hundreds of years in this country often can't afford a roof over their head. This area is beginning to look like homogeneous synonyms: uniform, identical, unvaried, consistent, and indistinguishable. Diversity is out. Homogeneity is in. Look at the tech companies, okay, the management. Everywhere you turn, if it's not keeping women out, it's keeping people of color out. We can't continue that process by keeping people of color out of housing in this area. We have to do something to make their lives reasonable. People have talked about the landlords who could take their property off the market. That's very true, they could, but they don't talk about something else. And that is the landlords who have a house, a 2-bedroom, 1-bath house, post-World War II raised foundation. We've all seen 1,000 of them. They're made for a family of 3 or 4, maybe 5, not 17. Those homeless people have to have somewhere to sleep. Some sleep in their cars while their kids sleep with family friends. My first house I rented in East Palo Alto, my neighbors, they were wonderful neighbors, all 17 of them. 3 families, 17 people, all pooling their money together to afford one roof, eating together their tacos and their beans, together, everything. That's not the way it should be, okay? That is not the way it should be. That landlord is being hurt because obviously 17 people are going to tear up that house a lot faster than 4. But nobody talks about that. That's the other part we're doing. Now let's talk about the long-term effects. Let's talk about a house full of little kids who cannot study because there's no quiet place in the house to study. Let's talk about kids who have to live with strangers who may or may not be molesters. That's the reality that we're addressing right now. Okay? So I encourage the City Council, I encourage the Housing Commission, please, please enact this legislation. As the good Reverend said, this is not the solution. The solution is the greed of this area. The solution is all the people, the NIMBYs, who don't want more housing built, because if there aren't more houses built, their multi-million-dollar house continues to rise in value. I'm sorry, I know no other word for that but greedy. Let's not let them keep these people down. We need more houses, but in the interim, we need to keep the rent down as much as possible, and when somebody gets pushed out of their place, we need to help them find another place. Thank you for this opportunity.
Up next is Pamela Jones.
Good evening. Pamela Jones, resident of Menlo Park. And I want to give you a little history about myself. My family moved into Palo Alto, and they lived on one of the two streets in the 1920s in which they allowed African Americans, then called Negroes. My father bought a home in East Palo Alto in 1957. Redlining and blockbusting were the sign of the times. That was the only place that we could live. I'm proud to say that I grew up into East Palo Alto and went to East Palo Alto schools. I bought my home in Belhaven, Menlo Park, because it was close to the school so my daughters could walk to school. I bought my home in 1973. I know this area intimately in a way that many of you could not possibly. And what I see today is just a continuation of what has been happening in this area. And now, politely, we call it gentrification. I call it recolonization. Now we have figured out a way to get rid of what few black and brown people are left in this community by raising exorbitant rents. That's what drove the Housing Commission to work so diligently on this ordinance. Yes, we have built affordable housing. We're building more low-income and affordable housing. It's all crammed into Belhaven because it's not wanted anywhere else in this community. There is land in the city of Menlo Park that, yes, those funds could be spent to build affordable housing. But there is a tremendous pushback, and probably that pushback comes from the very people who want to call a program that is about preventing homelessness, tenant displacement policy, preventing homelessness. They desperately try and call it rent control because it affects their pocketbook. How can anybody that with any humanity raise rent on a person who or a family that's been living in apartments for 10, 20 years? How can they raise that $600, $800, $1,200 a month? You know, what is that that's humanity? Well, yes, they bought it and they expected a certain income. Yes, because there's several companies that have come in and bought property, particularly in Belhaven and probably the same in East Palo Alto. They buy property because they know they're going to be able to sell it for a much higher price. I would add to that my experience from living in here at this time. Oh, I forgot to tell you, I'm a property owner with property on both sides of the freeway. I am a landlord. I'm a compassionate landlord, and when I did have to have roommates move, I gave them 3 months. One of them at one time did not have any other place. I said, fine, whenever you're ready to go. I found that one of the tenants in a family property never complained about anything that was wrong with the property because he's afraid we would raise the rents, because that's what many of the landlords do. So I'm a small landlord, and this policy, this ordinance, is not going to harm me at all. I am retired. Yes, this income is part of my retirement income, but I don't have to raise it exorbitantly to fix up the property because I planned for that. You really, at this time, we really need to think about humanity. What are we doing to people here? One other little piece to throw in here. There was a time when my property on the other side of 101 was worth half the cost, the cost of my other property that's on this side. One half. And my house was bigger than the house over here. Now, who knows why the property is suppressed? I understand why, because our roots go back here in this area since 1920. It was about 1929 when my grandparents bought property here. I understand that. By 2012, my property is now worth more than the piece over here. And that's not by accident. Almost daily, there are realtors that if I don't receive something in the mail, I receive a phone call, I receive a knock on the door telling me how much money I'm going to make if I would only move. From what has happened on the street that I live on, the people that have moved in don't look like me anymore, and the houses that have been bought for investment, they're not families living there, they're rooms, and the people that are living there for a short period of time, but they say they're not Airbnb. They're not college students because I asked those questions. We need this type of ordinance to prevent homelessness. We need this type of ordinance to prevent homelessness, and maybe it'll get the attention of those that feel as though we should be able to build affordable housing somewhere in the city of Menlo Park. Maybe they will decide to work with the council and encourage them to use city-owned property to build affordable housing. And when I say affordable housing, it's really all levels, and I'm particularly in my heart for the teachers because I'm a retired teacher. Thank you.
Up next is Miriam Young.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Council. I am a business owner here in Menlo Park. I've been here since 2009. At the time when things were very low in price, and I was fortunate to find a place to rent to start a very small sewing business, which Menlo Park has been very nice to support me in. I am a small business owner. I am the business. However, since being here, I was hoping that aside from being able to afford my little shop, which I ended up having to move because they sold the building and tore it down and built a huge building on top of. I was fortunate enough to find another spot right here in Menlo Park. Many of my other office mates had to move out of the area because they couldn't find anything. I was also pushed out of a place that I was renting at that time in Redwood City because the people decided to move back into the home, and I was renting a room at the time. So finding my office space for my studio to do my sewing business, I actually had to literally live in my business office for 6 months because I couldn't afford to get a place to live also and afford my office space. Fortunately, I've been able to be a caretaker or care provider for someone who's elderly, who's been able to be kind enough to let me also live in their home and allow me, having a bathroom in which I can use to take a shower and a kitchen in which I can use to prepare foods. I hate to consider myself a business owner as someone who might be considered homeless, but essentially that's probably what I am because I really don't have a home in which I can call my own. But I've had to make do with what I have, and I couldn't just say I'm very blessed to have the business. It's been able to support me enough to pay for my bills, for food, and having a car, and my other expenses, and pay for my office space. However, last year, I don't know where I got the smarts to sign a lease on my office, but I did sign it for 7 years at the time when I got it. When the lease came up last year, and I know that businesses are not probably under the same rules as homes and apartments. But as soon as the lease was up, my landlord's a pretty nice person. She didn't come at me right away with an increase. She waited about close to 6 months, maybe 4 months. But when she did come at me, she came at me with a 100% raise. So my rent essentially doubled. And I was pretty shocked and floored by it. I pleaded for her to consider raising it maybe 40% or 50%, but 100% seemed like an awful lot all at once. But I was told that I was still under market rate, even with the 100% raise. So that was not going to change. So I went back and pleaded, well, perhaps they could give me an additional 60 days in which to just get my funds together for this incredible increase. She came back and said that she would give me 30 days additional. So that was last September, and I've been on a month-to-month, and I've been lucky that there hasn't been any additional increases yet, but it has become very difficult for me to take care of this particular person now, and he will be going into a home, so I will be losing the space that I have in the house in Redwood City. And I'm looking at being back in my studio where I have my business. I do have friends, I do have some family around, but I think this ordinance would be really, really helpful because honestly, I have looked, I'm on BMR, I've paid every year. It's just unattainable for me to consider having my business. It's either rent a place and work my business out of a home, but even that's more expensive than what I'm paying, which I'm very fortunate to have decent rate on my business in my office or studio. I can't even see how I can afford my office space and an apartment. It just seems like a dream for me to have that here in Menlo Park. I love being here in Menlo Park, but it is really super expensive to even rent. Even a room is a lot of money. You know, it seems to cater, in my opinion, to those who make $150,000 a year, not to someone like me who's just trying to make an honest living. I am my own boss. I pay my own insurance. I pay for everything. I have to pay for office insurance. But I literally now, because I did used to work for a company, a corporation for many years, I am on a pension now. I started taking my pension about 2 years ago. Not a whole lot. And I tell you, honestly, that pension, if I didn't have it, wouldn't even help me pay my rent. And I wouldn't really be able to manage having this business here at all. So I thank the people in Menlo Park that use my services. I'm a seamstress. But I'm just hanging on by a thread, and I hope that this will help. Thank you.
Up next, and my apologies, Nazanin Saleh.
Good evening. Thank you for the opportunity to comment on the Menlo Park's proposed tenant relocation ordinance. I want to commend the City Council, the Housing Commissioners, and the City staff for the work they've done so far on crafting this ordinance and initiating the process to gather public comment. I also want to thank the tenants who've come up here and told their stories. It takes a lot of bravery to be that vulnerable in front of a room full of people, and your resiliency does not go unnoticed. My name is Nazanin Salehi. I'm a housing attorney at Community Legal Services in East Palo Alto. CLS provides eviction defense and tenants' rights-related legal services to clients in East Palo Alto, Menlo Park, and throughout San Mateo County and in Mountain View. As you've heard from some of the tenants here this evening, displacement is a real threat for residents of the Menlo Park community. And displacement has harsh impacts on individuals, families, and communities, including increased homelessness. The ordinance before the city is not the be-all, end-all when it comes to these issues. Stronger tenant protections are available as sound, reasonable policy choices that several cities to the south, namely Mountain View and San Jose, have made in recent years. Unlike in Menlo Park, most landlords in Mountain View cannot issue a $1,000 rent increase to an entire building. Some are trying, but because of rent stabilization, families are able to prevent those rent increases and instead see much more reasonable increases of 3.4% per year. To be clear, this proposed relocation assistance ordinance is not rent control. It does not make it unlawful for a landlord to increase rents by $1,000 or however much they wish. Rather, this ordinance will require landlords to offer relocation assistance where they've served a tenant with a no-fault eviction or a rent increase that would effectively displace the tenant. If a tenant is able to stay and pay the rent increase, the landlord will not be obligated to pay anything. That said, the ordinance before the city, as currently envisioned, will do two things. First, it will mitigate the impacts of displacement by providing families a soft landing as they transition to new housing. It will reduce the incidence of homelessness for low-income families who suffer traumatic rent increases or no-fault evictions. In other cases, it may prevent displacement and the negative impacts associated with it. The city has embarked on a months-long effort to understand the policy choices and make the recommendations before everyone today. The Housing Commission and the city staff have worked diligently to prepare well-thought-out, well-reasoned ordinance and the various explanatory reports for the public. For example, staff and housing commissioners responded to public input after their August meeting by including a provision that would allow for owner move-in without triggering tenant relocation assistance. This would ease the burden on, for instance, individual landlords who are forced to move back into their homes due to their own financial constraints. Similarly, this ordinance would not apply to rooms in owner-occupied homes. This is especially important for lower-income owners who co-house for a time to help meet expenses and aren't in the position of paying relocation benefits if, for example, they need to bring in a family member to live with them and there is no longer space for the co-housing tenant. Regarding concerns that this ordinance would run afoul of Costa-Hawkins, I want to reiterate that this proposed ordinance is not rent control. It does not tell owners what they can or cannot do in terms of setting rents. Second, it is not punitive. Rather, it would prevent landlords from passing on to the city and social service agencies the real costs of houselessness and tenants having to relocate. It would require landlords to bear some of the costs of the processes that they've initiated. The city should certainly study and evaluate this on its own, and I hope that they would do so with these arguments in mind. Finally, while the city has already undertaken great efforts to create more affordable housing, for instance, the 1300 Willow development, it will be years before there are enough affordable units created to meet the current demand. As everyone in this room knows, it often takes years for new affordable housing units to get approved, get built, and become available to tenants. But residents are being displaced now, and will continue to be displaced, particularly by escalating rent prices. Tenant relocation assistance is not perfect. It will not prevent displacement in the same ways that just cause protections or rent stabilization can. But the Menlo Park ordinance, as currently proposed, can prevent homelessness by giving families financial assistance if they have to move. And in some cases, it may prevent displacement and the negative impacts associated with it. It is my hope that the City Council and other stakeholders will continue to listen to the families and the individuals most impacted by the housing crisis and make the sound decision to increase local tenant protections by adopting the tenant relocation assistance in its current form with slight modifications in response to the public input process. Thank you.
Up next is Sylvia Van Praag. All right. Sarah Ordaz. And if anyone in the room would like to speak and has not yet turned in their card, please do so.
Hi, I'll be brief. I just want to thank the Housing Commission for making this proposal. I'm a renter. I moved here 5 years ago. I grew up on the East Coast, and all my life I wanted to live in California, sunny California, and it's great. But there are some issues, aren't there? My rent has doubled in the 5 years that I've lived here, and yet renting is our only option. And in most places, I'd be considered upper middle class. Hardworking, highly trained, PhD-level psychologist. I worked with anxious and depressed and suicidal teens of our community. My other renters are teachers, they're attorneys, or they're attendings at Stanford, they're firefighters, they're tech workers, they're preschool teachers. Our renters are dynamic contributors to our community and the fabric of our community, and there is quite a diverse range of renters, as we've heard here. For me to move, it would cost at least $2,000. I'd have to take off work to look for an apartment. I'd have to take time to pack, find a babysitter. It's not an insubstantial event. And I think a lot of homeowners don't necessarily recognize that. And so some people earlier mentioned that this was rent control. This isn't rent control. It's just a simple offset for a stressful, difficult event. For some, that can be catastrophic, and for others is just a difficult thing. But nonetheless, I'm glad that Menlo Park is considering this and has the values and the moral compass to think about people that don't just include the homeowners. Thanks.
Our next speaker is Jeff Deng.
Good evening, everyone. So I'm a resident of Menlo Park. I'm not a tenant. I'm not a landlord, but I want to share my thoughts on this topic. So first of all, I think everybody we get a good intent. We want to make Menlo Park an even better place for everyone, including tenants and also including landlords. So that's why I believe any solution that is going to work for the long term should consider the interests of both sides, including tenants and including landlords. So somebody actually said landlord is not really the owner of the property because they just rent the property from the bank, from the county. If you own a property and if you stop pay your mortgage or you stop pay your property tax, you will figure out who is the real owner of the property very soon, I promise. So from that perspective, I think landlord and renter are essentially the same type of people, and they should be treated equally, and they should be protected equally. But let's look at the current situation. So for tenant, if you're a tenant at Menlo Park, if you cannot afford the market price for the rent, so you may have to find a new place. I know it's not ideal, right? It's not the best thing, but I have been renting for many, many years before I can afford my own place, and I have moved many times as well. But as a renter, I feel like when the rent, for example, if the rent is too high, I cannot afford, I feel that I still have options. For example, I can downgrade my place. I can move to a smaller place. I can share the place with other people. I can move to a place maybe a little bit far from public transportation, but it's more affordable. I feel like I have different choices, and I never thought about it's the landlord's responsibility to pay for me to find a new place. Why? Because I'm grown up. I'm an adult. I should plan for the life of myself. Everybody should plan the life of himself or herself. Even my parents would not pay the cost for me to find a new place because they have their own life. They have their own problem to solve. I should be responsible for myself's life. So let's look at this. For example, I did a math before I come to this meeting. If I put my property at the Menlo Park to the rental market, it's far away from break even. I would lose money every month. So remember, I had to buy this property with market price. I had to pay maintenance fees, repair, innovations with the market price. I have to pay the gardener with the market price. I have to pay insurance from the market price. Nobody put any cap on the maximum increase every year for those costs. But now somebody is going to put a cap on the maximum rent I can increase every year. Do you think it's fair? Nobody protect me. If I want to be a landlord at Menlo Park, That's why after I do the math, I say, oh, I never want to be a landlord at the Manor Park. Let's look at what kinds of challenging the landlord would be facing here. So, for example, if the tenant moved out, and the landlord may not be able to find some new tenant soon, then the landlord may not have the money to pay for their mortgage, to pay for their property tax. As we said earlier, then he would lose his property. If the landlord loses their job, which is actually very likely if there's another economy downturn. A lot of people actually are talking about the next financial crisis. So it's likely that the landlord would have lost their job. Then they cannot pay for their mortgage, or they cannot pay for property tax. They would have lost their property. They may even go bankrupt. What if the landlord just like a mom pop, like a landlord, they have no job. They just rely on the rental income to make a living, to pay the tuition fee for their kids. There are many serious consequences that the landlord could face. Another example would be, what if there's an earthquake? It's very likely here in California. There would be a lot of money to repair the house or the property. What if any other natural disaster happen to the property, and then they have no money to make the repairment? What if the landlord gets sued by someone? They have a whole asset that the people could go after. Nobody talking about those kinds of challenges, risks that a landlord faced. And the people just assume landlord should have the money to pay the tenant, 3 months of the current rent, 2 months of the rental agent's fee. Is that fair? I don't think so. Also, do you know who actually in this process, who actually making money? The county, they have consistent income from the property tax. The bank who hold the mortgage, they have a very stable income every month. But the landlord is a very vulnerable group in this situation. But now we are asking the landlord to pay for the tenant to find a new place. Why are we not asking the county to do that? Why are we not asking the bank to do that? It's not fair to the landlord. So that's why I don't want to be a landlord here if these kinds of rules get passed in the city. So the second problem I want to talk about is we are talking about adding some extra protection to one side, right? But is that going to work? We have some live examples. Just look at San Francisco. What happened? Years of more strict protection for tenants. What happened? We are seeing more tensions between landlord and the tenant. We are seeing more fights, more lawsuits between them. Manor Park is a wonderful community. We don't want Manor Park to go to that directions. So we have to figure out something correct. Just adding protection for one side is not going to work. So are there any other solution? I believe so. For example, currently, if you want to do some addition to your place, it takes a long time for review, right? If you want to add some new housing in Manor Park, it takes a long time. So this housing crisis is a very simple problem. It's just supply and demand. Why not the city focus on increase the supply? make building new housing easier, faster, more cost effective. That's the fundamental solutions. How about making sharing a place easier? How about building like a place with like a high density so that more people have place to live? I think that's actually the ultimate solution to the current house crisis, and that's the fair solution.
Mr.
So
Bailey,
I
could you
totally
please-
disagree with the current.
Please wrap up.
Okay, so that's why I love this community. I want this community to become even better, but I don't agree that the current ordinance is going to be a working solution. We need to think about more about the fundamental problem, the root cause of the housing crisis, so that we can work together to find the right solution. Thank you.
All right, the last card I have tonight is Kelsey Baines.
Good evening. My name is Kelsey Baines. I am a psychologist at the Menlo Park Division of the Palo Alto VA, where I provide supportive services to veterans who are homeless or previously homeless. And I'm here tonight to enthusiastically support Tenant Relocation Assistance in Menlo Park. The program that I work for is called HUD-VASH. HUD-VASH is a partnership between Housing and Urban Development and VA Supportive Housing, and it provides vouchers to veterans to support them in getting market rate housing. Unfortunately, we have a limited number of vouchers, so the program was designed to be able to provide support to veterans who are homeless and at risk of homelessness, but because there is such a great need in the Bay Area, we cannot give vouchers to people who are at risk of homelessness or people who are newly displaced from their homes. So we are constantly fielding calls from Bay Area residents who have lived in their units a long time. I hear stories from 85-year-old veterans who have been in their unit for 30 years and call and say, my landlord sold the property and my rent is going up 100% and I don't know what to do, and we don't have anything to offer them through our program and have to direct them to community-based partners and kind of hope for the best and hope those veterans find a place to land. I myself personally have also been a victim of displacement. I was renting a place in Palo Alto, and the property was sold to an investor for $3.5 million. I fortunately am the product of privilege. I was able to get a great education, and I have parents that I can call if I need money. But we do know that displacement disproportionately impacts minority communities and communities of female-led households. So one of the things that makes the Bay Area such a special place is its diversity. So we really need to make sure we're protecting our diversity and protecting these vulnerable populations who are disproportionately impacted by diversity and won't land on their feet if we don't provide them assistance. I agree with several other commenters tonight that renter protections are not the solution. The solution to the crisis that we have right now is fixing the housing shortage. So we need to create more housing for people so we have plentiful housing. And we need to have housing at all income levels, including low income and very low income. I also support the comments about Menlo Park prioritizing building housing for very low income people on public property, including properties in West Menlo Park. And just want to reiterate that the best renter protection is plentiful housing. So just to sum up, I am in favor of this displacement protection measures and in favor of providing relocation assistance so that we can retain our most valuable citizens in Menlo Park. Thanks.
Okay, I received 2 more cards. Next up is Rovi Lynn Antonio.
Good evening. My name is Rovi Lynn Antonio, and I'm with California Apartment Association. We are an organization that represents rental property owners and property managers in San Mateo County area. We are here to reaffirm our strong opposition to the Housing Commission's proposal. As stated before, CAA is not opposed to the Housing Commission study for targeted relocation assistance program, but this version before us is rent control and just cause eviction. Based on public comments from last night, today, community members also agree that this is rent control. Under this proposal, the city is dictating that rent increases are capped at CPI plus 5%. This is rent control. Government is establishing the rent cap. Owners are told to keep rents below this figure or pay thousands of dollars as a penalty for giving rent increases. This is just cause eviction. The proposal determines reasons for property owners can remove a tenant. Without these reasons, owners cannot remove a problem tenant unless they pay the penalty. This is unenforceable. The city would need to create a multi-million-dollar bureaucracy in City Hall to operate this program. Rent control programs like this requires new city staff, new office, new laws, new taxes, and fees, all adding to the cost of providing housing and financially harming housing providers. Without enforcement, this program can lead to abuse and potentially become an income-generating scheme. This proposal harms housing providers in Menlo Park. Menlo Park is home to smaller, family-owned multifamily units. 96% of the multifamily buildings here are 50 units or fewer. These buildings are owned and operated by people living in Menlo Park, San Mateo County, or the Bay Area. Menlo Park does not have an overwhelming citywide problem with overseas, out-of-town, or absentee landlords. The Housing Commission should really look at short-term rental assistance programs for these types of emergencies that we're hearing tonight. We've heard comments about the needs for residents to get extra help if they lose their home due to a job loss or medical reasons. A short-term rental assistance program can provide financial assistance to cover missed rents or deposits to move into a new unit. Nonprofit organizations like Samaritan House provide this type of assistance and receive funding from broad-based funding sources. There's also the Housing Industry Foundation that provides emergency assistance to provide the gap from when if a tenant loses wages because of medical reasons, having to take care of a sick child, they can provide that funding that they need in order to meet the rent. If tenant displacement is a community-wide problem, then the solution to address it should come from a community-wide funding source, not just property owners. This is a more equitable approach and doesn't make providing housing a financial burden or a financial disincentive. So what is the true intention of this proposal? If we are trying to prevent displacement, then let's look at this closely. The true solution to displacement is creating more housing options for people. People are being displaced because there's lack of housing inventory. Cost of housing is increasing because there's a lack of housing. The problem here is that there's not enough housing for families. The focus should be to provide more housing that families, the workforce, and the missing middle can afford. These regulations will not solve this fundamental problem. We strongly urge you to go back to the drawing board, explore a short-term rental assistance program, and develop a true relocation assistance program that addresses displacements due to redevelopment, change of ownership, change of use, without harming the housing providers in the city. Thank you.
Up next is Ryan Kerrigan.
Hi, Ryan Kerrigan, Government Affairs with the Silicon Valley Association of Realtors. I previously sent a letter to the Housing Commission and want to reiterate our opposition to the draft ordinance. I think it's very clear, and it's been stated by the Housing Commissioners and others, that the intention of this is not to allow rents to increase. That is very clearly rent control. That is our organization's position. And we would urge city staff to carefully look at any legal issues that may create with state Costa-Hawkins law, which prevents or creates an exception for rent control on single-family homes. That's something that we have a big concern with. Secondly, it is not entirely clear how having this additional $20,000 relocation assistance payments actually solves the root of the problem. I think everyone in this room clearly understands the solution is more housing. That's something that our organization definitely supports more affordable housing, and have gone on the record supporting that many times in recent months, many other nearby cities. And that's something we certainly encourage all of you, and I think everybody understands the urgency and the need to recommend those solutions to council. But that being said, relocation assistance is also something that we recognize at times there is a need and a clear justification for, and have gone on record again supporting those in the appropriate circumstances. Recently, the County of San Mateo, we worked with them to implement a relocation assistance program for displaced renters. But we strongly believe those should be consistent with a true conversion or change of use or removal from the market of rental properties. And that should be something that, in our opinion, is targeted specifically to those who really are in need and are threatened because of their income levels. Recently, Palo Alto had a discussion. We worked with them and their council and coming to a compromise on what appropriate levels of AMI are for that. So certainly would encourage the Housing Commission to think carefully and strongly about what those appropriate levels are. But again, this ordinance is something that we view very clearly as rent control. It's something that we believe goes beyond the scope of the council's original intention, and certainly goes beyond the title of the draft ordinance. So we would essentially urge you to remove any relocation payment, fine, fee, penalty, or assistance that is triggered by a cap and rent increase. Thank you.
Okay, that's the last card I have this evening. For anyone who's interested, this will be coming back to the Housing Commission on October 10th, and then ultimately to the City Council sometime in the future. We would encourage anyone who would like to add additional comments to please write or email the city. Again, you can visit our website at menlopark.org/relocation assistance. That has contact information and, again, the draft language. So with that, thank you for coming out tonight.